The old Ford Explorer coughed twice before dying in the middle of White Horizon Auto Group's spotless showroom entrance. A worn leather keychain slipped from Melissa White's hand as she stepped into the blazing Arizona sun. A young salesman laughed loud enough for every customer to hear. "Ma'am, that SUV belongs in a junkyard, not a dealership." A few people smiled. Melissa quietly picked up the faded keychain, brushed away the dust, and walked inside without saying a word. Behind the glass wall, the regional director froze the moment she recognized the woman everyone else had mistaken for, just another struggling single mom. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if heartfelt stories about kindness, dignity, and second chances mean something to you, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined us for the journey ahead. 3 weeks earlier, long before anyone in Scottsdale laughed at the old Explorer, Melissa White was already awake at 4:47 every morning. She never needed an alarm anymore. Years of balancing motherhood grief and responsibility had trained her body to wake before the sun. The house was still wrapped in silence as she slipped out of bed, pulled on a gray cardigan over a white t-shirt, and quietly padded across the hardwood floor. The first thing she did every morning wasn't checking emails. It wasn't looking at financial reports. It wasn't calling executives from the company's headquarters. She walked into the kitchen and opened an old wooden recipe box. Inside wasn't a single recipe. There were folded notes, birthday cards, tiny sketches, receipts faded almost beyond recognition, and one photograph. A younger Melissa stood beside a smiling man wearing grease-stained coveralls. Between them sat a battered red toolbox with the words, "White Family Garage," painted unevenly across the side. Andrew White had painted those words himself. He had laughed afterward because the lettering leaned slightly to the left. "It doesn't have to be perfect," he had told her. "People remember honesty a lot longer than perfection." Melissa touched the edge of the picture with 2 fingers before sliding it back into the box. That small ritual lasted less than 20 seconds every morning. But it reminded her exactly why she refused to become someone success could no longer recognize. A few minutes later, 12-year-old Emily wandered downstairs with sleepy eyes and tangled brown hair. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, sweetheart." Emily climbed onto a kitchen stool, while Melissa poured pancake batter onto an old cast-iron griddle. "You have another meeting today." Melissa smiled. "I always have another meeting." Emily laughed. "That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one." The smell of pancakes slowly filled the kitchen. Emily reached for blueberries while Melissa packed her daughter's lunch. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, a small handwritten note folded into the corner. Melissa had written one every school day since kindergarten. Emily never admitted she still kept them. Melissa never admitted she knew. After breakfast, they stepped into the garage. Parked beside shelves filled with neatly organized tools sat the oldest vehicle Melissa still owned. A dark blue Ford Explorer. Nearly 20 years old. Its paint had faded beneath the Arizona sun. Small scratches decorated both doors. The driver's seat leather had cracked with age. The engine sometimes hesitated during cold mornings, yet every inch of it shone. Not because it was expensive, because someone loved it enough to care. Emily opened the passenger door. "You know," she said, "people at school think it's funny that my mom owns car dealerships but drives this." Melissa chuckled. "I know." "You could literally drive anything." "I could." "So, why don't you—" Melissa looked at the Explorer for several quiet seconds. "When your dad bought this SUV, he couldn't really afford it." Emily looked over. "He surprised me. Said one day we'd drive our children to school in it." She smiled softly. "We brought you home from the hospital in this truck." Emily ran her fingers across the dashboard. "I forgot. You took your first steps beside this passenger door." Melissa laughed. "You spilled chocolate milk all over the back seat." Emily groaned dramatically. Mom! You drew on the window with crayons. I was 4. You hit a frog inside once. Emily burst into laughter. I forgot about that. Melissa looked through the windshield. So many people think memories belong inside photo albums. She gently rested one hand on the steering wheel. Sometimes they're sitting right where you're driving. Emily quietly nodded. She had stopped asking why they still owned the Explorer. Now she understood. Some things carried more than people. Some things carried promises. Melissa reached into the ignition and picked up the worn leather keychain attached to the keys. The edges had softened after years of being held. Stamped into the leather were 4 simple words. Respect arrives before status. Andrew had commissioned it from a small leather shop shortly after they opened White Family Garage. Whenever a customer bought their first repaired vehicle, Andrew attached that keychain before handing over the keys. One customer had once asked why. Andrew smiled. Because everyone deserves respect before they earn your opinion. Melissa never changed that tradition. Nearly 20 years later, every first-time buyer at White Horizon Auto Group still received the same handmade leather keychain. Most customers assumed it was simply clever branding. Only Melissa knew it had started as one man's personal belief. After dropping Emily at school, Melissa drove toward downtown Scottsdale. Instead of heading to White Horizon's impressive corporate headquarters, she turned into a modest industrial district. A small brick building stood on the corner. Its sign simply read, White Family Garage. The original garage. She had never sold it. Inside, the smell of motor oil and fresh coffee remained exactly as it had decades earlier. An elderly mechanic looked up from beneath the hood of an old pickup truck. Morning, boss. Melissa laughed immediately. You've been calling me that for 20 years, Frank. Frank Dawson grinned. And you've been telling me to stop for 20 years. I'll probably keep trying. Frank wiped his hands with a shop towel. You here for the monthly inspection? Melissa nodded. Everything running smoothly. As smooth as old engines ever do. They spent nearly an hour walking around the garage. Melissa knew every employee by name. She knew whose wife had recently undergone surgery, whose son had earned a college scholarship, whose granddaughter loved drawing horses. People often asked how she managed thousands of employees across multiple dealerships. The answer wasn't complicated. She remembered people. Not employee numbers, not sales reports. People. As Melissa prepared to leave, Frank stopped her beside the Explorer. The transmission hesitated again. She smiled. You heard it? I've heard every sound this truck makes since before Emily was born. Melissa laughed. I think it's fine. Frank shook his head. You keep saying that. It still gets me where I need to go. For now. He crouched beside the front wheel. You ought to let one of the dealership service departments inspect it. Melissa smiled knowingly. They'd probably tell me to trade it in. They absolutely would. And then I'd remind them they're wrong. Frank looked up. You really should visit one of the stores unexpectedly. Melissa leaned against the SUV. I've been thinking about it. They act differently when executives schedule visits. I know. They'll never show you who they really are. Melissa looked across the parking lot. Her expression slowly became thoughtful. Years earlier, White Horizon had grown too large for her to personally oversee every location. Customer surveys looked excellent. Sales numbers continued climbing. Employee retention was healthy. Everything appeared successful. But numbers couldn't reveal character. A spreadsheet never showed whether a nervous young mother had been ignored because she wore thrift store clothes. A quarterly report never recorded whether an elderly veteran had been treated with patience. Profit measured transactions. Character measured moments no one believed mattered. Melissa climbed back into the Explorer. Before closing the door, she looked again at the leather keychain hanging quietly beneath the steering column. Respect arrives before status. She whispered the words almost unconsciously, not as a slogan, as a promise. Then she started the old engine. It hesitated, coughed once, then settled into its familiar rhythm. Melissa smiled. Just a little farther, old friend. She had no idea that in less than 3 weeks, this faithful old explorer would stop in front of one of her own dealerships, and a single careless sentence spoken by a young salesman would begin changing 2 lives forever. Ryan Harrison had never paid for a tank of gas until he was 28 years old. Not because he was lazy, because someone had always done it before he could. Someone parked the cars. Someone carried the luggage. Someone opened the doors. Someone handled the bill. Someone quietly solved every inconvenience before it ever reached him. Growing up inside this Harrison family estate outside Paradise Valley meant comfort had become so ordinary that Ryan rarely noticed it. The mansion overlooked the desert, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing mountains that glowed orange every evening. There were tennis courts, an infinity pool, a private gym, and a garage large enough to resemble a luxury showroom. Ryan loved the garage most, not because he appreciated engineering. He appreciated speed. Every birthday seemed to bring another expensive machine. A Porsche on his 21st. A Bentley after graduate school, a limited edition Aston Martin when he joined one of his father's investment firms. His friends admired the cars. Ryan admired the attention they attracted. To him, vehicles had become symbols. The newer the model, the more successful the driver. The more expensive the badge, the more important the owner. He never realized how dangerous that belief had become. One Friday evening, Daniel Harrison asked Ryan to meet him in the library. Unlike the rest of the house, the library had remained almost unchanged for 30 years. Walnut shelves reached the ceiling. Old business biographies lined the walls beside family photo albums. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. Daniel stood by the window holding 2 cups of black coffee. He handed one to his son. Ryan accepted it with a puzzled smile. "You sound serious." "I am." Daniel waited until Ryan sat down. "I've been watching you." Ryan shrugged. "I've been working." "You've been attending meetings." Ryan smiled politely. "I've been closing deals." Daniel nodded once. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Daniel asked a question that seemed strangely simple. "When was the last time someone told you no?" Ryan frowned. "What? When was the last time you heard the word no and couldn't make it disappear?" Ryan searched for an answer. Nothing came. Daniel wasn't surprised. "You've become very good at succeeding in rooms designed for you." Ryan leaned back. "I earned my degree." "You did." "I've worked." "You have." "So what's the problem?" Daniel walked toward one of the bookshelves. "The problem is that you think achievement and entitlement are the same thing." Ryan sighed. "Here we go?" "No," Daniel replied calmly. "Here we finally begin." He pulled an old photograph from a leather album and handed it over. The picture showed a much younger Daniel wearing stained jeans and standing beside a rusted pickup truck outside a construction site. Ryan stared at it. "I've never seen this." "I was 26. You owned that truck." "I slept in it for nearly 4 months." Ryan looked up, convinced his father was joking. Daniel wasn't smiling. "My first company failed." "You never told me." "I rarely talk about it." Ryan continued studying the faded photograph. "I thought Grandpa helped you." "He did later." Daniel closed the album. "But before anyone believed in me, I had to prove I respected people even when they couldn't help me." Ryan looked confused. "What does this have to do with me?" "Everything." Daniel sat across from his son. "I've received letters." "What kind of letters?" "From waiters." Ryan blinked. "Receptionists." Ryan looked uncomfortable. Drivers. He swallowed. Store employees. Ryan stared into his coffee. Daniel continued quietly. They all described the same man. I wasn't rude. You weren't kind. Ryan opened his mouth. Daniel raised one finger. You've mastered something dangerous. What? You've learned how to impress powerful people. Another pause. But you've forgotten how to respect everyone else. Ryan's expression hardened. I treat people fine. Daniel asked softly. Do you know the name of the man who parks your car every morning? Ryan hesitated. No. The woman who has served your lunch for the last 2 years? He looked away. No. The janitor on the 3rd floor. Ryan stayed silent. Daniel nodded sadly. Exactly. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times. Daniel reached into his desk drawer and placed a plain white envelope on the table. Inside was a single employee identification badge. Ryan Harrison was nowhere on it. Instead, it read Ryan Cole, Sales Associate, White Horizon Auto Group, Scottsdale Branch. Ryan frowned. What is this? Your new job? He laughed. Funny. I'm serious. Ryan's smile disappeared. You'll report Monday morning. I'm already working. Not anymore. You can't be serious. I've already spoken with your partners. Ryan's voice rose. You pulled me out of my own projects. Daniel nodded. For 1 year. Ryan stood. This is ridiculous. You'll earn commission like everyone else. I don't sell cars. You will. I have an MBA. So do thousands of people. Ryan paced across the room. This is beneath me. Daniel looked directly into his son's eyes. No. His voice remained calm. It is beneath your ego. Ryan stopped walking. You'll use the name Ryan Cole. I'm not hiding who I am. You are learning who you are. No one at the dealership will know your family. Ryan laughed bitterly. This is some kind of punishment. Daniel shook his head. If it were punishment, it would end after 12 months. Ryan folded his arms. This is education. He stared at his father for several long seconds. And if I refuse, Daniel answered immediately, then every trust fund account under my authority closes tomorrow morning. Ryan's jaw tightened. You'd actually do that? I already signed the paperwork. Silence returned. Ryan realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that his father had made a decision that money couldn't negotiate away. 3 days later, Ryan walked into White Horizon Auto Group wearing a navy polo shirt with his first name stitched above the pocket. No designer watch, no luxury car. Daniel had taken those too. Ryan arrived in an ordinary sedan rented under the company account. The showroom surprised him. It wasn't glamorous. It was busy. Families walked between vehicles with children chasing balloons. Retired couples compared SUVs. Teachers asked about financing. Construction workers examined pickup trucks before heading back to job sites. A receptionist smiled warmly. You must be Ryan. He nodded. I'm Olivia Brooks. She extended her hand. Regional Director. Ryan shook it. She had kind eyes, but carried herself with quiet authority. We're happy to have you. He forced a polite smile. Thanks. Olivia led him through the showroom. You'll shadow different salespeople for a while. Ryan glanced around. So, mostly used vehicles? Mostly people. He frowned. What? We don't sell transportation. She smiled gently. We help people solve problems. Ryan wasn't sure what that meant. Over the next several days, he learned financing systems, inventory, software warranty options, and customer paperwork. He learned quickly. He was intelligent, confident, articulate. Customers often liked him during the first few minutes. But then something subtle happened. Whenever someone arrived in an older vehicle, Ryan unconsciously became less interested. If a customer wore expensive clothes, he greeted them immediately. If someone stepped out of a faded minivan packed with children's backpacks, he suddenly remembered paperwork that couldn't wait. He never insulted anyone directly. He simply ranked them, without realizing it. Marcus Reed noticed first. The veteran service technician had worked in dealerships for over 30 years. He could usually tell what kind of person someone was by watching how they greeted the receptionist. One afternoon, Marcus found Ryan watching a sharply dressed businessman enter the showroom. Ryan hurried toward him. Meanwhile, an elderly woman carrying a worn canvas purse waited quietly beside a compact sedan. She stood there nearly 8 minutes before another salesperson noticed her. Marcus walked over afterward. "You missed someone." Ryan glanced toward the older woman. "I saw her." "Then why didn't you help?" Ryan shrugged. "I figured she was just browsing." Marcus smiled patiently. "You figured wrong?" Ryan looked unconcerned. Marcus rested one hand on the hood of a pickup truck. "Can I tell you something?" "Sure." "The nicest suit I ever saw belonged to a man who declared bankruptcy 6 months later." Ryan chuckled politely. Marcus continued, "And the oldest truck I ever serviced belonged to a rancher who paid cash for 6 new vehicles." Ryan smiled without really listening. Marcus sighed quietly. "Every customer has a story." Ryan nodded absent-mindedly. "I know." But he didn't, not yet. And in just a few weeks, one old Ford Explorer would pull into the dealership, bringing with it a lesson no classroom, no business school, and no billionaire father could ever teach. The Arizona sun had already climbed high by 11:18 that Tuesday morning. Heat shimmered above the black asphalt outside White Horizon Auto Group, turning the parking lot into a wavering mirror. Rows of polished SUVs and pickup trucks reflected the light so brightly that customers instinctively shielded their eyes as they walked toward the showroom. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly, while salespeople moved from desk to desk carrying folders and coffee cups. A television mounted on the wall played a financial news channel with the sound muted. Ryan Cole, at least that was the name on his badge, had just finished closing his second sale of the week. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "Not bad," another salesman, Tyler Benson, said with a grin. Ryan smiled. "I'm getting the hang of this." "You definitely know how to talk." Ryan shrugged. "People buy confidence." Marcus Reed happened to be passing by with a work order in his hand. "They buy trust," he corrected gently. Ryan offered a polite smile, but said nothing. Marcus continued walking toward the service department. Ryan watched him disappear through the double doors. Nice guy, he thought. A little old-fashioned. At exactly 11:27, a security camera mounted above the entrance captured an aging blue Ford Explorer turning slowly into the dealership. The vehicle moved carefully between rows of new cars. Its paint had faded unevenly under years of desert sunlight. The rear bumper carried several scratches. One headlight looked slightly cloudier than the other. It wasn't dirty. It was simply old. Melissa White eased the Explorer into a visitor parking space near the showroom entrance. She switched off the engine. Silence. She gathered a leather portfolio from the passenger seat. Today wasn't supposed to be emotional. It wasn't even supposed to be memorable. She had planned nothing more than a quiet, unannounced inspection. No executive assistance. No advance warning. No speeches. She wanted to see the dealership exactly as ordinary customers experienced it. That had become her habit over the years. Corporate reports always looked impressive. Mystery visits told the truth. Before opening the driver's door, Melissa glanced at the familiar leather keychain hanging beneath the ignition. Respect arrives before status. She smiled faintly. "Wish me luck, Andrew." She stepped outside. The heat wrapped around her immediately. She locked the SUV and started walking toward the glass entrance. Halfway there, the Explorer made a strange metallic click. Melissa stopped. She frowned. That's new. She turned back and tried the key again. The engine cranked, once, twice. Then nothing. She tried a second time. Only a weak clicking sound answered. The battery hadn't failed. Something else had. Melissa exhaled slowly. Not today. She wasn't embarrassed. Cars broke. She had spent enough years under hoods to know machines didn't care about schedules. She picked up her phone, intending to call roadside assistance later. For now, she simply needed someone to help push the Explorer a few feet away from the customer entrance. At that exact moment, Ryan stepped outside, carrying paperwork for another customer. He noticed the old SUV immediately. Then he noticed Melissa. Simple jeans, comfortable sneakers, no jewelry except a plain wedding band she still refused to remove. A leather handbag that had clearly seen years of use. To Ryan, the picture seemed complete before he'd spoken a single word. He assumed everything. He walked over with an easy smile. Need some help? Melissa looked relieved. Actually, yes. I think the transmission locked. Ryan glanced at the Explorer. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Interest faded. Judgment arrived. He circled the SUV once, then laughed quietly. You've definitely gotten your money's worth. Melissa smiled politely. I suppose I have. Tyler, standing near the showroom doors, overheard the conversation and wandered closer. Ryan tapped the faded hood lightly. This thing's older than some of our interns. Tyler chuckled. Melissa remained calm. I only need someone to help me move it. Ryan folded his arms. You know, he looked toward the rows of shiny new SUVs behind him. We actually sell reliable vehicles here. Melissa met his eyes. I noticed. Ryan grinned. Honestly, ma'am. He gestured toward the Explorer. That belongs in a museum. Several customers nearby glanced over. One young couple exchanged amused looks. Another salesman awkwardly pretended not to listen. Melissa simply nodded. I appreciate your opinion. Ryan wasn't finished. If it were mine, I'd stop fixing it. He smiled confidently. Sometimes you've got to let old things go. Melissa looked at the Explorer. For just a brief second, memories flickered across her face. Andrew laughing while washing the windshield, Emily asleep in the back seat after a camping trip, hospital parking lots, school pickups, late-night grocery runs, the first dealership contract she had signed while sitting in the driver's seat because she couldn't afford an office. Old things. Ryan had no idea what those words meant. Melissa answered quietly. Sometimes old things are worth keeping. Ryan shrugged. Sentiment doesn't get you very far? Before Melissa could reply, the leather keychain slipped from her fingers as she adjusted her portfolio. It landed softly on the pavement. Ryan looked down. The worn leather looked inexpensive, almost homemade. He smiled again. Looks like your keychain has seen better days, too. Melissa bent down slowly. She brushed a little dust from the leather before fastening it back onto her keys. Her movements were unhurried, almost protective. Ryan never noticed the words engraved into it. He never bothered looking closely. Marcus emerged from the service bay carrying diagnostic equipment. The moment he saw Melissa standing beside the disabled Explorer, he instinctively started walking toward her. Before he could reach them, his radio crackled. Marcus Bay 3 needs you immediately. He looked apologetically toward Melissa. She gave him a reassuring nod, silently telling him to go. Marcus hesitated, then turned back toward the workshop. Ryan noticed none of it. Melissa looked at him again. Would someone be available to help push it after you're finished? Ryan glanced at his watch. We're pretty busy. His tone remained polite, but distant. You might want to call a tow truck. Melissa nodded once. I understand. Without another word, she picked up her leather portfolio and walked toward the showroom entrance. As the automatic glass doors slid open, the receptionist looked up from her computer. "Good morning." She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes widened. Across the showroom floor, Olivia Brooks stepped out of her office carrying a stack of reports. She looked toward the entrance. The papers nearly slipped from her hands. Melissa White. Here. Without notice. Olivia had known Melissa occasionally visited locations unannounced, but never this branch. Never today. Their eyes met across the showroom. Melissa offered the smallest shake of her head. "Don't say anything." Olivia understood immediately. She smiled with practiced professionalism. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome to White Horizon. How may we help you today?" Melissa smiled back. "I'd like to look around first." "Of course." Ryan wandered inside a few moments later, completely unaware of the silent exchange. He walked past Melissa without another glance. To him, she was simply another customer who probably couldn't afford anything on the showroom floor. Melissa watched him greet a sharply dressed businessman with remarkable enthusiasm. His posture straightened, his smile brightened, his handshake became confident. Within seconds, he was offering bottled water and discussing premium financing options. Melissa didn't write anything down. She didn't need to. She had spent 20 years reading people. The contrast spoke louder than any report. She slowly walked through the showroom, taking in every conversation, every greeting, every overlooked customer. Outside, the old Explorer remained parked near the entrance beneath the relentless Arizona sun. Inside, a different engine had already begun turning. Not the engine of a vehicle, the engine of truth. And before the day was over, every person inside White Horizon Auto Group would discover that one ordinary-looking woman with an old SUV was about to expose far more than a broken transmission. Melissa wandered through the showroom as though she had nowhere in particular to be. That was deliberate. People behaved differently when they believed no one important was watching. She paused beside a silver crossover SUV, pretending to read the window sticker, while her eyes quietly followed the rhythm of the dealership around her. The showroom smelled faintly of fresh coffee tire rubber and the citrus cleaner the custodians used every morning. Soft instrumental music played through hidden ceiling speakers. Every few minutes, a bell rang near the finance office whenever another vehicle was sold. It was an atmosphere designed to make people feel welcome. Melissa had insisted on that years ago. She believed buying a car shouldn't feel intimidating. It should feel hopeful. A young receptionist named Hannah looked up from her desk and smiled. "Can I get you some water, ma'am?" Melissa returned the smile. "That would be lovely. Thank you." Hannah disappeared into the customer lounge and returned with a cold bottle of water. "There you go." Melissa accepted it. "What's your name?" "Hannah." "How long have you been here?" "Almost 6 months." "Do you like it?" Hannah brightened immediately. "I do. Everyone's been really kind." Melissa noticed she had answered everyone without hesitation. That mattered. Healthy workplaces often revealed themselves in small, unguarded responses. "Congratulations on your 6 months," Melissa said. Hannah looked surprised. "No customers ever said that." Melissa smiled. "Someone should." She continued walking. Across the showroom floor, Ryan had already moved on to another customer. This time it was a man wearing an expensive navy suit and carrying the key fob of a luxury German sedan. Ryan greeted him before the automatic doors had fully closed. "Welcome to White Horizon." His smile was broad. His handshake was immediate. Within seconds, they were discussing high-performance SUVs. Melissa watched quietly. She wasn't bothered that Ryan worked hard. She was bothered by whom he chose to work hard for. Near the far corner of the showroom, another customer had arrived almost unnoticed. A woman in her early 30s stepped inside, holding the hand of a little boy no older than 6. The child carried a faded dinosaur backpack. The woman wore grocery store work shoes and a supermarket name badge still clipped to her polo shirt. She looked exhausted. Her eyes scanned the showroom nervously before settling on a row of certified, pre-owned sedans. She approached one slowly. No one greeted her. She waited. 1 minute, then another. Ryan glanced toward her. Their eyes briefly met. Melissa noticed. Ryan looked away almost instantly. Instead, he continued laughing with the businessman examining luxury SUVs. The young mother remained standing beside the sedan. Her son tugged gently at her sleeve. "Mom." "It's okay, sweetheart. We can wait." She smiled at him. "We've waited this long." Melissa looked around. Several salespeople appeared busy, but not all of them. 2 stood near the coffee station discussing weekend golf plans. Another was organizing brochures. No one intentionally ignored the woman, but no one stepped toward her either. Sometimes neglect wasn't loud. Sometimes it simply accumulated one unnoticed minute at a time. Finally, a middle-aged salesperson named Linda Morris noticed the pair. She excused herself from another conversation and walked over. "Good afternoon." The woman's shoulders relaxed almost immediately. "I'm Linda. I'm Jessica." "What brings you in today?" Jessica hesitated. "I'm hoping to trade my old minivan." Linda nodded patiently. "No rush." Jessica looked embarrassed. "It has over 200,000 miles. Linda smiled. "Cars don't scare us." The little boy giggled. Melissa found herself smiling too. She drifted closer without interrupting. Jessica explained that she worked at a grocery distribution center during the night shift. The minivan had begun stalling on the highway. Twice. Her son attended elementary school across town. She couldn't risk breaking down again. "I don't need anything fancy," Jessica said quietly. "I just need something that starts every morning." Melissa felt something tighten inside her chest. She had heard those exact words hundreds of times over the years. People rarely bought transportation. They bought reliability, safety, time, peace of mind, hope. Linda never rushed the conversation. She listened first. Only afterward did she suggest vehicles. Melissa mentally noted Linda's name. Nearby, Ryan had successfully closed another premium sale. Tyler slapped him on the shoulder. "Nice work." Ryan grinned. "Big commission." He glanced across the showroom toward Jessica and Linda. "Still working with that budget customer?" Tyler shrugged. "A sale's a sale." Ryan laughed softly. "Not all sales are equal." Marcus Reed happened to be walking through the showroom carrying paperwork from the service department. He heard Ryan's comment. Without stopping, Marcus said quietly, "They're equal to the families driving them home." Ryan smiled politely. Marcus continued walking. Ryan rolled his eyes the moment he was gone. "He always talks like that." Tyler didn't answer. For the first time since Ryan had arrived, Tyler wasn't entirely sure Marcus was wrong. Melissa continued her quiet inspection. She wandered into the customer lounge. A coffee machine stood beside neatly arranged pastries. Everything appeared clean. A television played a cooking show. Magazines were stacked neatly on the tables. An elderly man sat alone near the window, reading paperwork through thick glasses. Melissa sat nearby. After a few moments, she asked gently, "Buying a car today?" The man smiled. "I hope so." "What are you looking for?" "A used pickup." "For work. For my grandson." His face brightened. "He just started an apprenticeship." Melissa nodded. "He must be excited." "He is." The man chuckled. "I'm more nervous than he is." They talked for nearly 10 minutes. No one interrupted. No one hurried him. Melissa learned he had spent nearly 40 years repairing school buses. His pension wasn't large. He had been saving for almost 3 years to help his grandson buy dependable transportation. As Melissa stood to leave, the elderly man smiled warmly. "Thank you." "For what?" "For talking." He folded his paperwork carefully. "Most people only notice old folks when we're in their way." Melissa felt those words linger long after she walked away. Near the finance office, she noticed another detail. A maintenance employee was quietly wiping fingerprints from the glass entrance. Several customers walked past him without acknowledgement. Melissa slowed. "Good afternoon." The man looked surprised. "Afternoon, ma'am." "Busy day?" He smiled. "Always." "Thank you for keeping this place beautiful." He blinked, then smiled even wider. "No one's ever thanked me for cleaning windows." Melissa nodded. They should. As she continued through the showroom, Olivia Brooks discreetly approached her. They stopped beside a display vehicle where no customers could easily overhear. Olivia kept her voice low. "I apologize." Melissa shook her head. "For what?" "I've seen enough today to know we have problems." Melissa looked around the showroom. "You also have good people." Olivia nodded. "We do." "Hannah." "Yes." "Linda." "Absolutely." "Marcus." Olivia smiled. "He has the biggest heart in the building." Melissa looked toward Ryan, who was enthusiastically presenting features to another affluent customer. "And Ryan." Olivia sighed. "Our top performer." Melissa turned her head. "By revenue." "Yes." "By character." Olivia remained silent. That silence answered the question better than words. Melissa glanced toward the large showroom windows. Outside, her old Explorer still sat where it had stopped earlier that morning. The sunlight reflected off its faded hood. A service technician had walked past it several times. No one had moved it. No one had even asked again if she needed help. The vehicle had become invisible, just as she had. Melissa understood something important. Ryan wasn't simply judging customers. The culture around him had quietly begun accepting those judgments, not because employees agreed with him, because too few challenged him. Cultures rarely collapsed all at once. They drifted, one ignored moment at a time, one overlooked customer at a time, one careless joke at a time. Melissa looked once more at the Explorer through the glass. The faded leather keychain still hung from the ignition, barely visible through the windshield. Respect arrives before status. She whispered the words under her breath. Then she turned back toward Olivia. "I've seen enough." Olivia studied her face. "What would you like me to do?" Melissa's answer came calmly. "Nothing." Olivia frowned. "Nothing?" "Not yet." Melissa looked across the showroom toward Ryan. "He thinks today is ordinary." She paused. "Let's keep it that way, until everyone is in the same room." Olivia understood immediately. The meeting Melissa was imagining would change far more than one young salesman expected, and somewhere outside beneath the relentless Arizona sun, the old Explorer waited patiently, as if it too knew its final lesson had only just begun. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the rush inside White Horizon Auto Group had begun to slow. Families who had spent hours comparing SUVs were signing paperwork in the finance office. Children who had been running between display vehicles now sat quietly with cookies from the customer lounge. Salespeople finally had a few moments to breathe. Ryan leaned against his desk, reviewing the commission numbers on his tablet. 3 completed sales, 1 pending delivery, a productive day. Tyler Benson walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "You earned this?" Ryan accepted one. "Thanks." Tyler glanced toward the showroom entrance. "That woman with the old Explorer is still here." Ryan looked over. Melissa was speaking with an elderly couple near a certified, pre-owned sedan. She wasn't trying to sell them anything. She was simply listening. Ryan shrugged. "Maybe she's waiting for roadside assistance." Tyler frowned. "I don't know." "What? There's something about her. Ryan laughed. Like what? I can't explain it. Ryan sipped his coffee. You're overthinking. Maybe Tyler was. Or maybe there really was something unusual about the quiet woman who seemed completely comfortable talking to receptionists, janitors, mechanics, customers, and executives alike. At exactly 3:18 p.m., a black Lincoln Navigator pulled into the employee parking area. Unlike most luxury SUVs arriving at the dealership, it stopped well away from the customer entrance. The driver stepped out first, then opened the rear passenger door. Daniel Harrison emerged wearing khaki pants, a navy sport coat, and no tie. He looked less like a billionaire and more like an experienced businessman who preferred not to attract attention. Only Olivia Brooks recognized him immediately. She had met him once during an industry conference several years earlier. Daniel offered a small nod. No announcement? Olivia returned the gesture. Of course. I'd like to observe. You'll have plenty to observe. There was something in her tone that made Daniel study her face more carefully. Has something happened? Olivia answered carefully. You may want to see it for yourself. Daniel didn't ask another question. He simply walked into the showroom as though he were another customer. Ryan never noticed. He was too busy explaining financing options to a couple interested in a luxury pickup. Daniel wandered slowly through the dealership. He watched sales conversations, service advisors greeting customers, technicians carrying parts, receptionists answering phones. He had visited hundreds of businesses over the years. Within minutes, he usually understood the culture. Healthy companies smiled naturally. Unhealthy companies smiled only when they believed someone important was watching. Near the waiting lounge, he spotted Melissa sitting beside the elderly man she had spoken with earlier. She was now helping him understand a financing document. Not because she worked there, not because anyone had asked, simply because he looked confused. Daniel stopped walking. Something about the scene reminded him of another time. Nearly 35 years earlier. A bank lobby. His own father struggling to understand loan paperwork after his reading glasses had broken. Everyone had been too busy to help, except one receptionist. She had stayed 20 extra minutes after closing. She never knew that small kindness had remained with Daniel for the rest of his life. He quietly continued observing. A few minutes later, Ryan finally noticed the distinguished older man examining a luxury SUV. Designer shoes, tailored jacket, confident posture. Ryan approached immediately. Good afternoon, sir. Daniel smiled politely. Good afternoon. I'm Ryan. Daniel shook his hand. What brings you in today? I was thinking about replacing my SUV. Ryan's enthusiasm became obvious. You've come to the right place. For the next several minutes, Ryan delivered one of the most polished presentations he had ever given. Performance, safety, technology, financing, warranty. He spoke with confidence. He listened carefully. He anticipated questions before Daniel asked them. Daniel couldn't help noticing the difference. This young man was capable, very capable. The problem wasn't competence. The problem was consistency. As they walked toward another vehicle, Daniel casually asked, Busy day? Ryan smiled. Pretty good. I noticed quite a few customers. We've had a strong afternoon. Daniel glanced toward Jessica, the grocery worker now finalizing paperwork with Linda. Looks like everyone found help. Ryan followed his gaze. Eventually. Daniel caught the subtle emphasis. Eventually. Ryan shrugged. You've got to prioritize. What do you mean? Ryan answered without thinking. If someone obviously isn't buying today, it makes sense to focus elsewhere. Daniel looked directly at him. And how do you decide that? Ryan smiled. You can usually tell. Can you? Ryan nodded confidently. Experience. Daniel remained silent. Experience, or assumptions. A few minutes later, Marcus walked through the showroom carrying a toolbox. One of the service advisors called after him. "The Explorer outside." Marcus nodded. "I'll take a look." Ryan overheard. "That old blue SUV." Marcus smiled. "That's the one." Ryan laughed. "I wouldn't waste too much time." Marcus stopped walking. "Why not?" Ryan gestured toward the parking lot. "It's probably worth less than the repair." Marcus looked through the showroom windows toward the Explorer, then back at Ryan. "You know," his voice remained calm, "sometimes people keep vehicles because replacing them would cost more than fixing them." Ryan shrugged. "Maybe," Marcus continued. "Sometimes they keep them because someone they loved once sat behind that steering wheel." Ryan said nothing. Marcus rested a hand on his toolbox. "And sometimes," he smiled gently, "it's none of our business why." Ryan looked slightly uncomfortable. Not guilty, just unconvinced. Marcus continued towards the parking lot. Daniel watched the exchange from across the showroom. He didn't interrupt. He didn't reveal himself. He simply observed. Outside, Marcus opened the Explorer's hood. Melissa joined him a moment later. They spoke quietly. Daniel couldn't hear the conversation from inside, but he saw Marcus laugh. Then he saw Melissa laugh too. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't about status. It wasn't about money. It was about people. Marcus pointed toward a worn section of the engine. Melissa nodded immediately. Then, to Marcus's surprise, she reached for a wrench lying nearby. Within seconds, she was helping him loosen a stubborn bracket with practiced hands. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You've done this before?" Melissa smiled. "A little." "A little," she laughed. "I used to spend more time under hoods than behind desks." Marcus watched her identify a faulty ground connection almost instantly. His eyes widened. "You're kidding." Melissa tightened the cable carefully. "Try it now." Marcus turned the key. The Explorer started immediately, smoothly. He stared at her. "You diagnosed that in under 2 minutes." Melissa shrugged. "My husband taught me." Inside the showroom, Daniel had been watching through the glass. He couldn't hear a single word, but he could see enough. The quiet woman wasn't merely the owner of an old SUV. She knew engines. She knew people. And somehow, she seemed oddly familiar. As Melissa closed the hood, Marcus thanked her. She shook her head. "You were about to find it anyway." He smiled. "Maybe." She reached into the driver's seat and picked up the worn leather keychain. Marcus finally noticed the engraved words, "Respect arrives before status." He read them silently, then smiled. "I like that." Melissa looked at the faded leather. "So did someone I loved." Marcus nodded respectfully. Neither of them noticed Daniel standing behind the showroom glass, reading those same 4 words from a distance. Something stirred in his memory. He couldn't yet place where he had seen that phrase before. But he was certain of one thing. The woman everyone else believed to be an ordinary customer was carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built far more than an old Explorer. And before the workday ended, Daniel Harrison would discover exactly who Melissa White really was. The dealership grew quieter after 4 o'clock. The last wave of afternoon customers had either driven away in new vehicles or settled into the finance office to sign paperwork. Outside, the Arizona heat had softened just enough for a light breeze to move across the parking lot. Melissa stood beside her Explorer for another moment, looking at the familiar hood that had carried her through nearly 2 decades of life. Marcus closed his toolbox. "I still can't believe you found that loose ground cable so quickly." Melissa smiled. "I've chased stranger problems than that." Marcus laughed. "I can tell." He wiped his hands with a faded blue shop towel before glancing toward the showroom. You know, I've worked on cars for 36 years. Melissa nodded. I can see that. But every now and then someone reminds me there are still things to learn. Melissa leaned against the Explorer. My husband used to say engines tell you what's wrong if you stop trying to prove you're smarter than they are. Marcus chuckled. I would have liked him. You would have. There was no sadness in her voice anymore, only gratitude. Grief had changed over the years. It no longer arrived like a storm. It came quietly now, like an old song heard from another room. Marcus looked at the leather keychain hanging from the ignition once more. Those words. Melissa looked down. Respect arrives before status. They're simple. They're supposed to be, Marcus smiled. Simple things usually survive longer. Melissa nodded. So do good habits. Inside the service department, compressed air hissed from a tire machine, while another technician rolled a toolbox across the concrete floor. Marcus gestured toward the workshop. Would you like to see where the real magic happens? Melissa laughed. I'd love to. The service department looked completely different from the polished showroom. There were no glossy lights, no spotless marble floors, only concrete stained by years of honest work. Toolboxes lined the walls, engines rested on metal stands, country music drifted quietly from an old radio mounted above the parts counter. Melissa slowed her pace. She always loved workshops. They reminded her of where everything had begun. A young technician looked up. Hey, Marcus. Marcus pointed toward Melissa. She diagnosed a bad ground cable faster than I did. The young mechanic smiled politely. Seriously, Melissa shrugged. I got lucky. Marcus laughed. No, you didn't. As they walked deeper into the workshop, employees greeted Marcus naturally. Some nodded toward Melissa. No one asked who she was. No one cared what she drove. Back here, competence mattered more than appearances. Melissa appreciated that. Marcus stopped beside an aging pickup truck raised on a hydraulic lift. Transmission rebuild. Melissa looked underneath. Looks like you've almost got it. You really know your way around a shop. I used to spend every day in one. Marcus studied her for a second. You don't miss it, Melissa smiled. Every single day. He looked surprised. Even after all your success? She answered without hesitation. I miss fixing problems I can hold in my hands. Marcus nodded slowly. I understand that. It's easier than fixing people. They both laughed quietly. After a moment, Marcus grew thoughtful. You know, he leaned against the lift. I've been thinking about Ryan. Melissa didn't interrupt. Marcus continued. He's frustrating. She smiled faintly. I noticed. But that's not the whole story. Melissa folded her arms. I'm listening? Marcus looked across the workshop toward an empty service bay. About 4 months ago, I tore a muscle in my shoulder. Melissa remembered seeing the slight stiffness in his movement earlier. I should have taken time off. But you didn't. Marcus smiled. I've got a granddaughter starting college. Melissa understood immediately. So I kept working. He looked down at his hands. One night we stayed late finishing repairs before a holiday weekend. The shop was almost empty. My shoulder locked up. I couldn't lift a transmission housing. Melissa listened carefully. I told everyone to go home. No one argued. I figured I'd come back the next morning. He smiled quietly. About 10 minutes later, Marcus paused. Ryan walked back in. Melissa looked genuinely surprised. He had already clocked out. He noticed I was still here. Marcus laughed softly. I expected him to complain. What happened? He rolled up his sleeves. Marcus looked toward the ceiling as though replaying the memory. He spent nearly 3 hours helping me finish the job. Melissa said nothing. He didn't know much about repairs, but he listened. He carried tools, held flashlights, Cleaned parts. He never once checked his phone. Marcus smiled. When we finished, I thanked him. What did he say? Marcus's eyes softened. He said, "My dad always told me you never leave someone alone to finish heavy work." Melissa absorbed every word. Did anyone else know? Marcus shook his head. No. He asked me not to tell anybody. Why? Marcus shrugged. He said it wasn't a big deal. Silence settled between them. Melissa stared at the floor. The image she'd formed of Ryan shifted ever so slightly. Not enough to excuse what he'd done, but enough to complicate it. People were rarely only one thing. Some hid kindness behind arrogance, others hid pain behind anger. Leadership meant learning the difference. Marcus watched her expression carefully. I figured you should know. Melissa looked up. Why? Because I don't think he's cruel. She nodded slowly. I think he's immature. Marcus smiled. Exactly. He notices the wrong things first. Melissa sighed. And the right things second. Marcus chuckled. If someone can reverse that order, he'll become a very different man. At that moment, Ryan entered the service department carrying a clipboard. He stopped when he saw Melissa standing beside Marcus. Oh, I didn't realize you were back here. Melissa smiled politely. I was just thanking him for helping with my SUV. Ryan glanced toward the Explorer outside. It running again? Yes, Marcus answered before Melissa could. Loose ground connection. Ryan looked mildly surprised. That was quick. Marcus nodded. Melissa found it. Ryan blinked. You? Melissa smiled. I've worked on a few engines. Ryan looked at her old jeans, then at the workshop. He couldn't quite picture it. You don't seem like... He stopped himself. Melissa raised an eyebrow. Like what? Ryan hesitated. I just mean... Marcus quietly rescued him. She knows cars. Ryan nodded awkwardly. Right. An uncomfortable silence followed. Ryan checked his clipboard. I was looking for Marcus. I'm here. One of the Silver Ridge customers says his truck makes a knocking sound. Marcus nodded. I'll be there. Ryan turned to leave. Before reaching the door, he glanced back. For the first time all day, he looked at Melissa differently. Not with respect, not yet, but with curiosity. The woman driving the worn-out Explorer had repaired her own vehicle. She spoke comfortably with mechanics. She carried herself with quiet confidence. She wasn't fitting into the story Ryan had written about her, and that unsettled him. After he disappeared into the showroom, Marcus looked toward Melissa. He noticed. Melissa smiled. Not enough. No, but more than this morning. Melissa looked through the glass wall separating the workshop from the showroom floor. Ryan was already helping another customer. Professional, confident, capable, yet still judging the world before understanding it. She slipped the leather keychain into her pocket. Respect arrives before status. The word suddenly felt heavier than usual. She had arrived at the dealership expecting to evaluate sales performance. Instead, she had found something far more difficult. A young man who possessed both genuine kindness and damaging prejudice. Firing him would be easy. Teaching him would be much harder. Melissa had already begun making a decision. By tomorrow morning, every employee would believe they were attending an ordinary staff meeting. None of them knew it would become the most important lesson their dealership had ever received. At 4:52 p.m., just 8 minutes before the dealership normally closed, every computer screen inside White Horizon Auto Group displayed the same message. Mandatory staff meeting. Showroom floor. 5:10 p.m. attendance required. The notification appeared so suddenly that conversations throughout the building paused. Salespeople looked at one another. Finance managers frowned. Receptionists exchanged curious glances. Even the technicians in the service department received the alert on the monitors mounted above their workstations. Tyler Benson looked over Ryan's shoulder. That's strange. Ryan nodded. We don't usually have meetings on Tuesdays. Especially not after closing. Ryan shrugged. Probably monthly numbers. He wasn't worried. If anything, he felt confident. His sales had been among the strongest in the building that week. He had no reason to expect criticism. Across the showroom, Olivia Brooks quietly walked from desk to desk. Please finish with your customers first, she said gently. We'll begin in about 15 minutes. There was something different about her voice. Calmer, more deliberate. Marcus noticed it immediately. So did Linda Morris. Neither of them said anything. Outside, Melissa remained beside her Explorer for a few final moments. She looked at the dealership reflected in the driver's window. Years earlier, she had dreamed of building places where ordinary families would feel respected from the moment they arrived. Buildings alone couldn't accomplish that. People did. She reached into the vehicle and removed her leather portfolio. Inside was a thin black notebook, no more than 20 pages. Every observation from the day had been written there in neat handwriting. No angry remarks, no emotional reactions, only facts. 11:31 a.m. customer ignored for over 2 minutes. Reception excellent. Linda listened before selling. Ryan prioritized appearance over need. Marcus demonstrates servant leadership. Culture strong in service department. Inconsistent on showroom floor. Melissa closed the notebook. She never believed in making decisions while angry. Written facts were harder to argue with than feelings. She walked toward the entrance. Olivia was already waiting. Everything's ready. Melissa smiled. Thank you. Conference room. Melissa looked across the nearly empty showroom. No. Olivia understood immediately. The showroom. I want everyone standing together. Olivia nodded once. It'll be done. Meanwhile, Daniel Harrison remained near the customer lounge. Throughout the afternoon, he had quietly observed nearly every employee in the building. The differences had become impossible to ignore. Some greeted everyone equally. Some greeted only opportunity. One person, however, fascinated him most. Melissa. She had spoken with custodians, mechanics, receptionists, elderly customers, single parents, and technicians with exactly the same warmth. Never once had she introduced herself. Never once had she sought attention. Daniel found himself wondering who she really was. He walked toward Olivia. Excuse me? She smiled politely. Yes, sir. I've enjoyed observing your team. Thank you. I'll be leaving shortly. Olivia hesitated. If you have another 10 minutes, Daniel noticed the slight smile she couldn't quite hide. You may witness something worth remembering. He studied her expression. What kind of something? I think. She chose her words carefully. Today is going to become part of our company's history. Daniel looked genuinely intrigued. I'll stay. At exactly 5:09 p.m., the last customer drove away. The showroom doors locked automatically. Employees gradually gathered near the center display area, where a newly released luxury SUV sat beneath bright lights. Conversations buzzed quietly. Any idea what's going on? No clue. Inventory changes. Maybe bonuses. Ryan stood beside Tyler, sipping the last of his coffee. I told you. This is probably about quarterly targets. Tyler wasn't convinced. Olivia stepped forward. The conversations slowly faded. She looked across the room. Nearly 40 employees stood waiting. Salespeople, receptionists, finance specialists, technicians, custodians, everyone. Thank you for staying. Her voice carried easily across the showroom. I know everyone wants to go home. Several people smiled. Olivia continued. Today's meeting wasn't scheduled. Because today's visit wasn't scheduled. Ryan frowned. Visit. He glanced around. No executives were visible, at least none he recognized. Olivia looked toward the main entrance. "The owner of White Horizon Auto Group spent the day with us." Whispers immediately spread through the room. "The owner? I thought she lived in Chicago. I heard he never visits. No one told us." Ryan felt only mild curiosity. He had never met the owner. In fact, he knew almost nothing about White Horizon beyond the employee handbook. Olivia smiled gently. "She wanted to experience our dealership exactly as our customers do." Ryan folded his arms. "Interesting." A few employees instinctively straightened their posture. Others glanced nervously toward one another. Marcus quietly looked toward the entrance. He already knew. The glass doors opened. Melissa walked inside, carrying the same worn leather portfolio she had held all day. She wore the same jeans, the same white shirt, the same comfortable sneakers. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Only the room had. Ryan stared blankly. She walked directly past him without hesitation. Past Tyler, past the reception desk, past the sales offices, straight toward Olivia. The entire showroom fell silent. Olivia smiled warmly. "Good evening, Melissa." Melissa returned the smile. "Good evening." Then Olivia turned toward the employees. "It is my privilege to introduce the founder-owner and CEO of White Horizon Auto Group." She paused. "Melissa White." Silence. Absolute silence. Ryan's heartbeat seemed to stop. No, that couldn't be right. His eyes darted from Olivia to Melissa, then back again. The woman with the faded Explorer, the woman he'd laughed at, the woman he'd told belonged in a museum, the woman whose keychain he had mocked. His mouth went dry. Tyler whispered under his breath, "Oh, my." Linda slowly lowered the folder she had been holding. Hannah looked completely stunned. One of the technicians quietly muttered, "She's the owner." Marcus simply closed his eyes for a brief second, not because he was surprised, because he had hoped Ryan would somehow avoid this moment. Daniel Harrison stood near the back of the showroom. His expression changed instantly. Melissa White. He finally recognized the name. Years earlier, he had read multiple business journals describing how a widow had transformed one struggling repair garage into one of the Southwest's most respected dealership groups. She rarely gave interviews, rarely appeared in public, preferred staying behind the scenes. Daniel looked at Melissa with newfound respect, then slowly turned toward his son. Ryan hadn't moved. His face had lost all color. Every careless sentence from earlier replayed in his mind with unbearable clarity. "That belongs in a museum. We sell reliable vehicles here. Sometimes you've got to let old things go. The keychain has seen better days too." Each word felt heavier now than when he had spoken it. Melissa stepped forward. She didn't stand behind a podium. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked around the room, meeting every employee's eyes. When her gaze finally reached Ryan, she didn't glare. She didn't frown. That somehow made everything worse, because disappointment carried more weight than anger. Ryan lowered his eyes. For the first time since joining White Horizon, he had nothing to say, and for the first time in many years, he realized that the most expensive mistake a person could make wasn't damaging a car. It was revealing the kind of person they became when they believed no one important was watching. No one spoke. Even the air conditioning seemed louder than usual. Melissa stood in front of nearly 40 employees, without the slightest trace of triumph on her face. She had every reason to embarrass Ryan publicly if she wanted to. Instead, she placed her worn leather portfolio on the hood of the display SUV and rested both hands lightly upon it. "Good evening, everyone." Her voice was calm, warm, almost conversational. "Thank you for staying a little late." Several employees shifted uneasily. Ryan kept his eyes fixed on the polished floor. Melissa continued. I know some of you are wondering why I didn't announce my visit. She smiled gently. If I had today, wouldn't have taught me anything. A few people exchanged nervous glances. She looked around the showroom. I've spent the entire day watching something much more important than sales numbers. She paused. I watched conversations. Silence. I watched eye contact. Another pause. Arn! I watched who was greeted first. Her eyes drifted slowly across the room. And I watched who was invisible. No one moved. Melissa wasn't accusing anyone. She was describing what she had seen. There are many things this company measures, she continued. Revenue. Inventory. Customer satisfaction. Service turnaround. She smiled faintly. But there is one thing no report has ever been able to measure. She looked toward Hannah at the reception desk. The feeling a customer has during the first 30 seconds after walking through our doors. Hannah swallowed quietly. Melissa nodded toward her. Hannah? The young receptionist looked startled. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Hannah blinked. For what? For offering water to a stranger before knowing whether she intended to buy anything. Tears immediately gathered in Hannah's eyes. I was just doing my job. Melissa smiled. No. You were doing something more important. You made someone feel welcome. The room remained silent. Melissa turned toward Linda Morris. Linda. Linda straightened instinctively. You listened before you sold. Linda smiled modestly. My father taught me that. I'm glad he did. Melissa looked toward the service department. Marcus? Marcus folded his hands in front of him. Yes, Melissa. You reminded someone today that every customer has a story. Marcus nodded once. I've always believed that. I know. Melissa smiled. And thank you for still believing it. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. She had thanked everyone. Everyone except him. Daniel Harrison watched quietly from the back of the room. He wasn't observing Melissa anymore. He was watching his son's face. For perhaps the first time in Ryan's life, confidence had disappeared completely. Melissa slowly opened her leather portfolio. Inside was the small black notebook. She held it up. I wrote only facts today. She looked around. No opinions. No assumptions. No emotions. She opened to the first page. 11:31 a.m. She read calmly. A young mother wearing a grocery store uniform waited over 2 minutes before receiving assistance. Jessica. Ryan remembered her immediately. Melissa closed the notebook. I eventually watched Linda help her purchase reliable transportation. She smiled softly. That family drove home safer tonight because someone chose patience. She turned another page. No. 12:18 p.m. An elderly grandfather thanked a stranger simply for talking to him. Several employees lowered their eyes. Melissa continued. He didn't thank anyone for finding him a truck. He thanked someone for making him feel seen. She paused. I want every employee here to remember something. No customer ever forgets how we made them feel. The word settled over the room. Melissa looked toward the large showroom windows. Outside, the blue Explorer was still visible beneath the fading evening sky. When my husband and I opened our first garage, her voice softened. We had exactly 2 repair bays. Several employees leaned in slightly. We couldn't afford matching uniforms. Our office roof leaked every spring. We had 1 coffee maker. It broke twice. A few quiet smiles appeared. Melissa laughed softly. And our waiting room had 3 folding chairs from a church basement. The room relaxed just enough to breathe. But we had one rule. She reached into her pocket. Slowly, she removed the worn leather keychain, the same one Ryan had laughed at only hours earlier. She held it between her fingers. The faded leather caught the light. Some of you noticed this today. Marcus smiled quietly. Melissa lifted it slightly. My husband gave this to me before we opened our garage. She looked down at the engraving. Respect arrives before status. Her thumb gently brushed the worn edges. He believed these 4 words could build a company. She smiled. I thought he was being sentimental. A soft laugh rippled through the employees. He turned out to be right. Melissa looked back up. When we repaired someone's car, we attached one of these keychains. Not because it advertised our business, but because we wanted every customer to remember one thing. She paused. They deserved respect before we knew anything about them. Silence returned. Melissa slowly walked away from the display vehicle. She wasn't pacing dramatically. She simply moved through the employees, stopping briefly beside different people. She finally stood only a few feet from Ryan. He still couldn't look at her. Melissa didn't raise her voice. Ryan? His throat tightened. Yes, ma'am. She noticed he was trembling. So am I. Ryan looked up in surprise. Melissa smiled sadly. This conversation isn't easy for either of us. Daniel watched every second. Melissa folded the notebook closed. When I walked into this dealership today, she spoke gently. My vehicle stopped running. Ryan closed his eyes. He knew what was coming. I asked for help. Another pause. I received advice. No bitterness, no sarcasm, just truth. Melissa continued. My vehicle was described as belonging in a museum. Ryan's shoulders dropped further. Someone suggested old things should be let go. Several employees looked toward him. No one seemed angry, only disappointed. Melissa looked toward the Explorer outside. I've been driving that SUV for 19 years. My daughter came home from the hospital in it. I drove it after my husband's funeral. It carried tools when I couldn't afford employees. It carried loan documents when banks said no. It carried my daughter to school every morning. She looked back at Ryan. So when someone laughed at it today, she smiled gently. They weren't laughing at an old truck. They were laughing at an entire life they couldn't see. Ryan's breathing became shallow. Every sentence landed harder than if she had shouted. Melissa wasn't trying to make him feel small. She was allowing him to understand the weight of his own words. I don't believe you intended to insult my memories. Ryan whispered, I didn't. I know. Melissa nodded. I believe you made a judgment before asking a question. He couldn't argue, because she was right. She continued quietly. And that's far more dangerous. The showroom remained absolutely still. Daniel Harrison felt an unexpected knot in his own throat. Melissa had not once mentioned wealth, or authority, or ownership. She wasn't teaching employees how to respect executives. She was teaching them how to respect strangers. She looked around at everyone once more. If I had walked in wearing a designer suit, if I had arrived in a brand new luxury SUV, if someone had announced I owned this company, she smiled sadly. Today would have been a very different day. No one denied it, because everyone knew it was true, especially Ryan. He finally forced himself to meet Melissa's eyes. His voice cracked. I'm sorry. Melissa looked at him for several long seconds. The room waited. No one knew what she would do next. Would she accept his apology? Would she fire him? Would she ask him to leave? Instead, Melissa asked a single question, one so quiet that everyone instinctively leaned closer to hear. Ryan, if I really had been a struggling single mother today, she paused, would your words have hurt any less? Ryan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because for the first time in his life, he understood that there was only one honest answer, and it broke something inside him. Ryan stood motionless. Melissa's question continued echoing through the silent showroom long after the words themselves had faded. If I really had been a struggling single mother today, would your words have hurt any less? He searched desperately for an answer that would somehow soften the truth. There wasn't one. His throat tightened until speaking felt impossible. Finally, he lowered his head. No. The single word barely rose above a whisper. Melissa heard it. So did everyone else. No, Ryan repeated, his voice shaking. They wouldn't have. He closed his eyes for a moment. I would have hurt her just the same. No one moved. No one rushed to rescue him from the weight of his own admission. For the first time in his life, Ryan wasn't being cornered by another person's anger. He was being confronted by his own conscience. Melissa nodded gently. Thank you for answering honestly. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only quiet sadness. She knew real change could never begin with excuses, only truth. Ryan slowly lifted his eyes. I'm ashamed. His voice cracked. I've been replaying everything I said since you walked through those doors. He swallowed hard. I thought I was making a joke. Melissa remained silent. I never stopped to think, he looked toward the old Explorer outside, that every scratch on that vehicle might mean something to someone. His shoulders sagged. I never even asked your name. Melissa answered softly. No. I didn't ask if you needed help. No. I judged you before I knew anything. Melissa nodded once. Yes. Ryan took a shaky breath. And I did it because I believed I could tell who mattered just by looking. Those words hung heavily over the room. Daniel Harrison closed his eyes for a brief second. They were painful to hear, but they were true. Melissa quietly folded her hands. I appreciate your honesty. Ryan looked confused. You do? I do, he frowned. After everything, Melissa smiled sadly. Honesty is the first brick. Ryan didn't understand. The first brick? The first brick you lay when rebuilding character. Silence settled again. Daniel stepped forward from the back of the showroom. Employees instinctively turned to look at the distinguished man they still believed was simply another customer. Ryan noticed him immediately. His stomach dropped. His father. Daniel walked slowly toward the center of the room. Every step echoed across the polished floor. He stopped beside Melissa, then turned to face the employees. My name, he paused, is Daniel Harrison. Several employees gasped quietly. Tyler's eyes widened. Marcus recognized the name immediately. Olivia simply folded her hands. She had suspected this moment might come. Daniel continued. Some of you may know me. Others nodded uncertainly. Ryan stared at the floor again. He already knew what was coming. Daniel looked directly at his son. I asked Ryan to work here under a different last name. The room became even quieter. No one here knew he was my son. He glanced toward Melissa. That was intentional. Ryan's breathing grew heavier. Daniel continued calmly. I wanted him to discover something no university can teach. He looked around the showroom. How people deserve to be treated when they have nothing to offer you. Another long silence. Daniel sighed. I failed. Ryan looked up immediately. Dad? Daniel raised one hand gently. No. This isn't your burden alone. Ryan looked confused. Daniel smiled sadly. I spent years teaching you how to build wealth. I didn't spend enough time teaching you how to recognize dignity. His voice remained calm, but his eyes revealed disappointment deeper than anger. I assumed experience would teach you compassion. It doesn't. Only humility does. Ryan could no longer hold back his emotions. I'm sorry. Daniel nodded. I know. I embarrassed you. Daniel shook his head. No. Ryan frowned. I embarrassed myself. Another pause. I embarrassed the values I hoped to pass on. The room watched father and son without a sound. Melissa quietly stepped back, allowing the conversation to unfold. Daniel turned toward her. Melissa. His voice carried genuine respect. I owe you an apology. She smiled politely. You owe me nothing. I do. He shook his head. My son represented himself. But he also represents the lessons he received. He lowered his head slightly. I'm sorry. Melissa regarded him for a long moment. I accept your apology. Daniel nodded gratefully. Then Melissa looked at both men. I'd like to tell you something. They listened. When Andrew and I opened our first garage, she smiled at the memory. We believed mistakes came in two forms. Ryan wiped his eyes. The first kind, Melissa continued, the mistake that reveals who you are. And the second, the mistake that changes who you become. Ryan stared at her. I don't understand. Melissa walked toward the old leather keychain resting on the hood of the display SUV. She picked it up again. When someone makes a mistake, she looked directly at Ryan. I ask only one question. She paused. What happens next? Ryan stood silently. Melissa continued. If today's humiliation teaches you nothing, then it was meaningless. But if today becomes the day you begin seeing people differently, she smiled gently, then perhaps it becomes one of the most valuable days of your life. Ryan nodded slowly. I want that. Melissa looked carefully into his eyes. Do you? Yes. Why? He hesitated. At first he searched for the answer he thought everyone wanted. Then he stopped. No. He shook his head. I've spent most of my life trying to impress people. He looked around the showroom. I've measured success by who noticed me. His voice became steadier. But today, he glanced toward Jessica's empty chair in the waiting area. I realized I couldn't even remember the faces of the people I ignored. His eyes filled again. I don't want to become that man. Melissa studied him carefully. Years of leading people had taught her that remorse and transformation were not the same thing. Many people cried when consequences arrived. Far fewer changed after the tears ended. She wasn't looking for emotion. She was looking for responsibility. She finally asked one more question. If I fired you tonight, Ryan answered immediately, I'd deserve it. If I did, she continued, what would you learn? Ryan opened his mouth, then stopped. After several moments, he admitted quietly, probably that powerful people can ruin your career. Melissa nodded. And would that lesson make you kinder? He slowly shook his head. No. She looked around at every employee. I don't build this company by collecting punishments. She paused. I build it by developing people. Confused murmurs spread softly through the room. Ryan looked up in disbelief. Melissa wasn't finished. She walked back toward the center of the showroom. Tomorrow morning, every person standing here would witness a decision none of them expected. Not because Ryan had escaped the consequences of his actions, but because Melissa White believed that changing one heart could transform an entire company. And she was about to give Ryan Harrison the hardest assignment of his life. No one left. Although the meeting had already lasted far longer than anyone expected, not a single employee glanced at a watch or reached for a car key. Something more important than a workday was unfolding before them. Melissa looked around the showroom one more time before speaking again. I know some of you are expecting me to announce a termination. No one answered. Several employees had indeed expected exactly that. Ryan certainly had. He stood with his shoulders lowered already, imagining how he would clear out his desk before the rest of the staff arrived the next morning. Melissa folded her hands in front of her. I've owned businesses long enough to know that firing someone is sometimes necessary. She paused. But it should never become the first solution simply because it's the easiest one. She looked directly at Ryan. I don't believe today revealed an evil man. Ryan blinked. I believe it revealed an immature one. Those words landed differently, not as an insult, as a diagnosis. Melissa continued. You know how to sell. You work hard. You learn quickly. I've watched customers trust your knowledge. Ryan listened silently. But I also watched something else. She took a slow breath. You decided who deserved your best before you ever learned their names. Ryan lowered his eyes again. There was no point denying it. Melissa turned towards the rest of the employees. How many of you have heard the phrase? She smiled softly. Don't judge a book by its cover. Nearly every hand rose halfway. She nodded. It's a wonderful saying. Her expression grew thoughtful. But I don't think it's enough. The employees looked puzzled. The problem isn't only judging people, she continued. The problem is believing we have enough information to judge them in the first place. The room fell silent again. Melissa walked slowly toward the showroom windows, where the Explorer remained parked outside beneath the orange glow of the setting sun. I've spent years visiting our dealerships without announcing who I am. She looked back toward everyone. Do you know why? No one answered. Because I wanted every employee to treat me exactly the way they would treat my customers. She smiled gently. And today, she paused. Most of you did. Several employees relaxed. Melissa looked toward Hannah. You welcomed me, toward Linda. You listened, toward Marcus. You helped, toward the technicians. You respected my vehicle. She then turned back to Ryan. And you reminded me why this meeting was necessary. Ryan swallowed. Melissa walked back to the center of the showroom. I've made my decision. Everyone instinctively straightened. Ryan closed his eyes. I'm not terminating your employment. The sentence echoed through the showroom. Several employees looked genuinely surprised. Tyler glanced toward Marcus. Marcus remained expressionless. He had hoped for mercy. He simply hadn't expected it. Ryan opened his eyes, slowly. What? Melissa continued before anyone could speak. Starting tomorrow morning. She looked directly at him. Oh, you will no longer work luxury vehicle sales. Ryan nodded quietly. He understood. You are being transferred. Another pause. Effective immediately, Elaine. You will become the coordinator of our New Beginnings mobility program. Ryan frowned. He had never heard of it. Melissa noticed. Some of our newer employees probably haven't. She looked around the room. The New Beginnings program was created 12 years ago. It helps single parents, military veterans, teachers, nurses, first responders, and working families purchase dependable used vehicles with flexible financing. She smiled. It has never been our most profitable division. She paused. It has always been our most important one. Ryan looked confused. You want me to work there? Yes. For how long? Melissa answered calmly. Until you no longer ask that question. A few quiet smiles appeared around the room. Ryan wasn't smiling. He genuinely didn't understand. Melissa continued. Your office will move to Building C. Ryan knew Building C. It wasn't connected to the polished luxury showroom. It sat behind the main dealership beside the certified pre-owned inventory. Older vehicles, smaller commissions, different customers. I'll lose most of my income. Melissa nodded. Probably. Ryan stood quietly. He expected himself to feel angry. Instead, he felt something else. Embarrassed. Because the very first thing that entered his mind had been money. Melissa seemed to read the thought across his face. This assignment isn't about reducing your paycheck, she said gently. It's about expanding your perspective. She reached into her portfolio and removed a thin folder. Inside were photographs. She handed them to Ryan. He looked down. The first picture showed a smiling nurse standing beside a 10-year-old sedan. The second showed a father fastening his daughter's backpack before school. The third showed an elderly veteran leaning proudly against an old pickup truck. The fourth showed a woman holding twins outside one of White Horizon's dealerships. Ryan looked up. What are these? Our customers. Melissa smiled. Every vehicle in those photographs changed someone's daily life. She pointed toward the first image. That nurse no longer rides 3 buses before her night shift. Another. That father stopped missing his daughter's school concerts because his truck finally became reliable. Another. That veteran can attend dialysis appointments without asking neighbors for rides. She looked at Ryan. Tell me. She paused. Which one matters less than selling a luxury SUV? Ryan stared at the photographs. He couldn't answer. Because suddenly, none of them seemed small. Melissa stepped closer. I don't need another talented salesman. She spoke quietly enough that only those nearest could hear clearly. I need another leader. Ryan looked confused. I'm not a leader. No. Melissa smiled gently. Not yet. Silence, she continued. For the next 6 months, you'll personally meet every applicant entering the New Beginnings program. You'll review every story. You'll understand every family. You'll explain financing yourself. You'll deliver every set of keys. Ryan looked down at the photographs again. And if I fail, Melissa answered immediately, you'll try again. And if I disappoint you, she smiled, you already have. Those words might have sounded cruel from someone else. From Melissa, they sounded honest. She continued. What matters now isn't whether you disappointed me. It's whether you'll disappoint the next person who walks through our doors. Ryan slowly nodded. I understand. Melissa tilted her head slightly. No, she smiled. I don't think you do. A few employees chuckled softly. So let me be clearer. She looked directly into his eyes. I want every person who enters Building C to leave believing they mattered. Whether they buy a vehicle or not. Ryan nodded again. This time, his voice was steadier. I think I understand. Melissa wasn't completely convinced, but she noticed something different. Earlier that day, Ryan had answered quickly. Now? He paused before speaking. He was beginning to think before judging. It was only the first step. Yet first steps mattered. Daniel Harrison finally walked toward his son. He placed one hand gently on Ryan's shoulder. I've spent years trying to teach you business. He smiled sadly. Melissa just taught you something far more valuable. Ryan looked at his father. I almost wish she'd fired me. Daniel shook his head. No. You wish consequences ended today? Ryan frowned. They don't? Daniel looked toward the photographs still resting in Ryan's hands. They begin tomorrow morning. Melissa closed her portfolio. The meeting is over. Employees remained standing for another moment before slowly dispersing. No one rushed toward the exit. Conversations were quieter than usual, more thoughtful. Marcus walked past Ryan and gently squeezed his shoulder. I'll see you in Building C. Ryan looked surprised. You work there too? Marcus smiled. Every Wednesday. Why? Because every old car deserves a mechanic who believes it's worth fixing. He paused. So does every young man. Marcus walked away before Ryan could answer. Ryan looked down once more at the faded photographs in his hands. For the first time since joining White Horizon, he wasn't thinking about commissions. He was wondering about the names behind the faces. And before the week was over, those names would begin changing his life in ways no promotion ever could. Ryan arrived at Building C at 7:12 the next morning. The building sat behind the gleaming main showroom, separated by a narrow service road and a row of mesquite trees. It wasn't impressive. There were no polished marble floors, no luxury coffee machine, no dramatic vehicle displays beneath spotlights. A modest blue sign above the entrance simply read, New Beginnings Mobility Program. Ryan stood outside for a moment, holding a cardboard box containing the few personal items from his former desk. A framed photograph from college, 2 notebooks, a coffee mug, a pen set his father had given him years earlier. He stared at the sign. Yesterday, he would have considered this building the least important part of White Horizon. Today, it was his entire job. Marcus pulled into the parking lot a few minutes later in an aging pickup truck that looked almost as old as Melissa's Explorer. He climbed out carrying 2 paper bags. Morning. Ryan nodded. Morning. Marcus handed him one of the bags. Breakfast. Ryan looked inside. A bacon and egg biscuit and a cup of coffee. You didn't have to do that. Marcus smiled. I know. They walked inside together. The office contained only 6 desks, a small waiting area, a coffee maker that had clearly been repaired several times. Children's coloring books rested on a low table beside a basket of crayons. Ryan noticed them immediately. Marcus saw where he was looking. Kids spend a lot of time here. Ryan nodded quietly. I never thought about that. You will. At exactly 8 o'clock. The front door opened. A woman in Navy hospital scrubs stepped inside, carrying an insulated lunch bag. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. She looked exhausted. Good morning. Ryan stood automatically. Welcome? The woman smiled politely. I'm looking for someone who can tell me about the assistance program. Ryan almost asked what kind of vehicle she wanted. Instead, he remembered Melissa's words. Listen first. He gestured toward a chair. Please. She sat down. My name is Angela. I'm Ryan. She looked surprised. You don't need my last name. Ryan paused. Yesterday, he probably would have asked. Today? No. He smiled gently. I'd rather know your story. Angela stared at him for a second. Then she laughed softly. No salesperson has ever said that. Ryan smiled awkwardly. I'm trying something different. She relaxed. I'm an emergency room nurse. Ryan nodded. I work 12-hour night shifts. My son's daycare opens at 6. I usually sleep 4 hours. Ryan listened without interrupting. My car has 243,000 miles. She reached into her purse and unfolded a repair estimate. The transmission failed. Ryan glanced at the paper. Nearly $6,000. He looked back at her. What happens if you can't replace it? Angela smiled sadly. I lose my job. Ryan felt the weight of those words. Not because they were dramatic, because they were ordinary. This wasn't a rare tragedy. It was everyday life. He began asking careful questions. How far do you drive? How much can you comfortably afford each month? What matters most to you? Safety fuel economy, cargo space. For nearly 30 minutes, Ryan forgot he was selling anything. He simply listened. When Angela finally left, she wasn't driving home in another vehicle. Approval would take a few days. Yet she smiled more brightly than when she had arrived. Marcus noticed. You know why she's smiling? Ryan looked over. I don't. Because someone finally listened. Ryan looked down at Angela's paperwork. For the first time, he understood. People often arrived carrying far more than loan applications. They carried fear. The next appointment arrived 15 minutes later. A middle-aged elementary school teacher named Robert Ellis. He apologized 3 separate times for wearing dusty shoes. Ryan remembered how many customers he had unconsciously judged by shoes alone. Now he noticed something different. Robert had probably come directly from school. The dust wasn't carelessness. It was playground dirt. "My old truck finally quit." Robert smiled apologetically. "I've been borrowing my brother's." Ryan asked, "What do you teach?" "4th grade." "How long?" 22 years. Ryan smiled. "You must have taught a lot of children." Robert laughed. "Enough to know multiplication tables better than my own birthday." By lunchtime, Ryan had met 5 families: a teacher, a nurse, a postal worker, a recently divorced father, a military veteran. Not one conversation resembled another. Yet they all shared something. None of them wanted sympathy. They wanted reliability, dignity, a fair chance. After lunch, Marcus found Ryan staring quietly at a stack of applications. "Tired?" Ryan looked up. "I've sold fewer cars today than I usually sell before noon." Marcus nodded. "And?" Ryan hesitated. "I've worked harder." Marcus smiled. "That's because you're carrying stories now." Around 2 o'clock, another appointment arrived. A young woman stepped inside with 2 little girls. The younger child clutched a stuffed rabbit whose ears had nearly fallen off. Ryan recognized the woman immediately. Jessica, the grocery worker from yesterday. She looked equally surprised. "Oh." She smiled uncertainly. "You work back here now." "I do." Jessica hesitated. "I hope that isn't because of—" Ryan interrupted gently. "It is." Her expression changed. "I'm sorry." Ryan shook his head. "No. I needed to be here." Jessica looked confused, but didn't ask. Instead, she sat down. "The financing department asked me to bring a few more documents." Ryan nodded. "No problem." While reviewing the paperwork, he noticed the younger daughter coloring quietly at the children's table. The older girl watched her little sister with unusual attentiveness. Ryan smiled. "Do they always stay this close together?" Jessica laughed softly. "They've learned to. My evening shifts make them grow up too fast." Ryan remembered Melissa's words. Every customer has a story. He had heard Marcus say something similar. Now he finally understood why. Jessica finished signing the last document. Before leaving, she stopped. "I almost didn't come back." Ryan looked up. "Why?" She smiled awkwardly. "I didn't think people like me belonged in dealerships." The sentence struck him harder than anything else he had heard all day. People like me. Yesterday, he had helped create that feeling. Today, he wanted to erase it. "I'm glad you came back." Jessica smiled. "So am I." After she left, Ryan remained seated for several minutes. He wasn't reading paperwork anymore. He was thinking. How many people had walked away from him over the years believing they weren't welcome? How many families had he quietly dismissed before learning their names? How many opportunities had he lost to become a better person simply because he had looked instead of listened? Late that afternoon, Melissa quietly entered Building C. No one announced her arrival. She simply stood near the entrance, watching Ryan finish another conversation with an elderly veteran. She noticed several small things. Ryan stood when customers entered. He asked names before discussing vehicles. He no longer interrupted. He took handwritten notes instead of glancing repeatedly at his computer. Most importantly, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. When the veteran left, smiling, Melissa approached. Ryan looked up. "I didn't see you." "I know." She glanced around the modest office. How was your first day? Ryan looked at the stack of completed applications, then toward the empty children's coloring table, finally toward the front door through which Jessica had walked only an hour earlier. He smiled quietly. I sold one car. Melissa waited. Ryan continued. But I think... He paused, searching for the right words. I met 6 people. Melissa smiled. For the first time since the old explorer had broken down outside the showroom, she believed real change had finally begun. 6 months passed more quietly than Ryan ever imagined. No dramatic headlines announced his transformation. No viral videos celebrated his apology. No magazine wrote about the billionaire's son who learned humility. Most people inside White Horizon simply noticed that Building C had become busier than ever. Families who had once been intimidated by large dealerships began recommending the New Beginnings mobility program to neighbors, co-workers, and church friends. Word spread the old-fashioned way. One conversation at a time, one grateful customer at a time, one dependable car at a time. Ryan no longer measured his weeks by commission statements. He measured them by phone calls. The engine's still running perfectly. My daughter made it to college. I finally stopped borrowing rides. My mom can get to chemotherapy without missing appointments. Those calls stayed with him long after the workday ended. Every morning before unlocking the office, he walked through the small waiting room. He straightened the children's books, sharpened the colored pencils, checked the coffee machine, refilled the small basket of granola bars Marcus had suggested keeping for customers who often arrived without breakfast. Months earlier, Ryan would never have noticed whether a waiting room had crayons. Now he knew exactly which children preferred dinosaurs and which reached first for princess coloring books. One Tuesday morning in early spring, Marcus walked into Building C carrying a service report. He stopped at the reception desk. You've got visitors. Ryan looked up. Scheduled. Marcus smiled. I don't think so. Ryan stepped into the lobby. Standing near the entrance were Melissa and Emily. Melissa wore the same simple style she always preferred, blue jeans, a light denim jacket, and comfortable walking shoes. Emily had grown slightly taller over the past several months. She carried a sketchbook tucked beneath one arm. Ryan smiled warmly. Good morning. Melissa returned the smile. Morning. Emily waved. Hi, Mr. Ryan. He laughed. You don't have to call me Mr. My mom says respect isn't about age. Ryan glanced toward Melissa. She smiled. I might have said something like that. Ryan invited them inside. I wasn't expecting you. Melissa looked around the office before answering. That's usually the point. Ryan laughed. Fair enough. He noticed Emily looking through the front windows toward the parking lot. The old explorer sat outside, freshly washed, still carrying the same faded paint, still wearing time with quiet dignity. Emily caught him looking. I knew you'd notice. Ryan smiled. I always notice that SUV now. Emily walked towards the window. When I was little, she rested one hand against the glass. I thought every family had one special car. Ryan listened quietly. I didn't understand why my friends kept getting new ones, she smiled. I used to ask Mom all the time. Ryan nodded. So did I. Emily laughed. I remember. She looked back toward the Explorer. One summer Dad let me help wash it. Her voice softened. I was only 5. I accidentally scratched the driver's door with the garden hose. Ryan glanced toward the faint mark still visible beneath the driver's side window. It had never been repaired. Emily continued. I cried for an hour. Ryan smiled gently. What did your dad do? He handed me a towel. She laughed at the memory. And he said, she looked at Melissa. Now it looks like our family's truck instead of somebody else's. Melissa smiled quietly. Ryan stared at the old scratch on the Explorer. For months he had noticed it every time Melissa visited. He had assumed it was ordinary wear. Now, it had become part of a family's history. Emily opened her sketchbook. "I've been drawing something." She handed it to Ryan. Inside was a pencil drawing of the Explorer. But it wasn't parked outside a dealership. It stood in front of a tiny repair garage beneath an old wooden sign reading "White Family Garage." Beside the SUV stood 3 figures: a younger Melissa, a smiling man in mechanic's coveralls, a little girl holding both of their hands. Ryan looked up slowly. "You drew this?" Emily nodded. "My art teacher said drawings should tell stories." Ryan swallowed. "This one does." Melissa looked at the sketch for a long moment. "I've never seen that memory on paper before." Emily smiled. "I wanted Dad to have one." Silence settled gently over the room. Not painful, peaceful. Ryan carefully closed the sketchbook. "I owe both of you another apology." Melissa looked at him. "You've already apologized." "I know." He took a slow breath. "But I didn't understand everything then." He turned toward Emily. "I laughed at something I thought was just an old vehicle." His voice grew quieter. "I didn't realize I was laughing at your childhood." Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over and looked out the window once more. "My dad used to say, 'Cars remember things.'" Ryan smiled sadly. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was." Emily turned back. "But I don't think he'd want you to feel bad forever." Ryan felt his throat tighten. Children often possessed a kind of wisdom adults complicated. Melissa watched the exchange without interrupting. She wasn't interested in forcing forgiveness. Real forgiveness had to arrive naturally. Ryan finally looked at Melissa. "I've spent months meeting families." She nodded. "I know. I've heard stories I never imagined." She waited. "I've learned that almost nobody asks for an easy life." Melissa smiled faintly. "They ask for a fair chance." Ryan nodded. "Exactly." He reached into his desk drawer. Inside lay dozens of customer thank you cards. One card in particular remained on top. He handed it to Melissa. It was from Angela, the emergency room nurse he had met on his first morning in Building C. The handwritten message read, "Because you listened before you sold, my son still gets to hug me every morning before school, instead of wondering whether my car will leave me stranded after another night shift. Thank you for treating us like people first." Melissa read the card slowly. When she finished, she placed it back on Ryan's desk. "You didn't write those words?" "No." "You earned them." Ryan looked down. "They mean more than any sales award I've ever received." Melissa believed him, because she could see it, not in his words, in his habits. While they had been talking, the front door had opened twice. Both times Ryan had instinctively looked up, smiled, and greeted each customer before returning to the conversation. 6 months earlier, he would have noticed expensive watches. Now, he noticed nervous faces. Melissa glanced toward the waiting area. The crayons had been sharpened. The coffee was fresh. The chairs were arranged so parents could easily watch their children. Tiny details, almost invisible, yet they revealed everything. She smiled. "I think you're finally beginning to understand what we actually sell." Ryan looked around Building C. "We don't sell cars." Melissa waited. "We sell peace of mind." She nodded. "And," Ryan looked toward the Explorer once more, "we remind people that they matter." Melissa's eyes softened. For the first time since that painful afternoon outside the showroom, she no longer saw the young man who had mocked an old SUV. She saw someone who had finally learned to recognize the invisible weight every stranger carried, and she knew the time had come to trust him with something far greater than a second chance. 1 year after the afternoon that had changed everything, White Horizon Auto Group no longer looked quite the same. The polished showroom still sparkled beneath bright lights. Luxury SUVs still occupied the front display. Sales targets still mattered. Quarterly reports still filled executives' inboxes. But something far more important had begun appearing in those reports. Customer comments. Melissa had asked Olivia Brooks to add a new section to every monthly performance review. It wasn't measured in dollars or percentages. It measured moments. Did an employee greet customers within 30 seconds? Did they ask questions before making recommendations? Did customers mention feeling respected? Did anyone describe feeling ignored? At first, some managers complained. Those things can't be measured. Melissa had smiled every time she heard that argument. They already are. By the people who walk out our doors. Over the past year, written comments had replaced assumptions. One elderly customer wrote, "They treated me like I was buying the most expensive truck on the lot, even though I only purchased a used sedan." A single father wrote, "My son spilled juice in the waiting room. Instead of making us feel embarrassed, an employee helped us clean it up and gave him another coloring book." A retired teacher wrote, "They remembered my name when I returned 2 weeks later." Melissa read every comment personally. Not because she had time, because she believed culture lived inside details. On a bright Monday morning, Ryan walked into the training room carrying a stack of folders. The room held 12 newly hired sales associates from different White Horizon locations across Arizona. Some had years of experience. Others were beginning their first jobs. Ryan stood at the front without a PowerPoint presentation, without motivational slogans, without sales charts. Instead, he placed 3 objects on the table: a worn work glove, a child's crayon drawing, and Melissa's old leather keychain. The trainees exchanged puzzled looks. Ryan smiled. "Before we talk about selling cars," he looked around the room, "I'd like to tell you about the biggest mistake I've ever made." No one interrupted. Some had heard rumors. Very few knew the whole story. Ryan picked up the keychain. "I once believed expensive cars belonged to important people." He paused. "I also believed old cars told me everything I needed to know about their owners." He smiled sadly. "I was completely wrong." For nearly an hour he shared the story, not to embarrass himself, but to protect others from repeating his mistake. He described the old Explorer, the faded paint, the careless jokes, the woman he had judged before asking her name. He never hid his own failures. The trainees listened in complete silence. One young salesman finally raised his hand. "What happened after she forgave you?" Ryan smiled gently. "She didn't simply forgive me. She trusted me." He looked down at the keychain. "Trust is much harder to receive than forgiveness." Another trainee asked, "Weren't you angry about being transferred?" Ryan laughed. "I thought my career had ended." He looked around the room. "It turned out my career hadn't started yet." A quiet murmur spread through the group. Ryan continued, "The most important customers you'll ever meet," he paused, "probably won't look important." He pointed toward the work glove. This belonged to a construction worker who saved for 4 years before buying a used pickup. Then toward the crayon drawing. "A little girl drew this while waiting for her mother to finish paperwork." He smiled. "She later mailed it back to us because she said this dealership gave her mom her smile back." Several trainees looked visibly moved. Ryan picked up the keychain last. "And these 4 words changed my life." He read them aloud. "Respect arrives before status." The room remained quiet. No one wrote anything down. Some lessons didn't belong in notebooks. Later that afternoon, Melissa watched the training session from behind the observation window. She hadn't announced her visit. Old habits never disappeared. Olivia joined her. "He tells the story every class." Melissa smiled. "I know. He never leaves out the embarrassing parts?" He shouldn't. Olivia looked through the glass at Ryan. I almost don't recognize him anymore. Melissa answered softly. I do. Olivia glanced sideways. You do? I recognize the man Marcus told me about, Olivia smiled. The one who stayed late, helping in the workshop. Melissa nodded. He was always there. He just had to become stronger than his pride. The classroom door opened. The trainees walked out laughing together. One young woman remained behind to speak with Ryan. Melissa stayed where she was. The woman looked nervous. I wanted to ask you something. Ryan smiled. Go ahead. My mother cleans hotel rooms. She hesitated. I've always been embarrassed to tell people. Ryan listened. She continued quietly. Not anymore. Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, What's your mother's name? Carol. What does Carol do every day? The young woman smiled. She gets up at 4:30. She catches 2 buses. She cleans 15 rooms. Ryan nodded. Sounds like someone who works harder than most executives. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. I never thought about it that way. Ryan smiled warmly. When people tell you what someone does for a living, he paused. Try hearing what they sacrifice instead. Melissa quietly looked away. That sentence hadn't come from any training manual. It had come from experience. Just before closing time, Marcus entered Building C carrying a clipboard. Melissa. She turned. I've got something to show you. He led her toward the service area behind the used car lot. Parked near one of the inspection bays sat an old green station wagon. Its owner, a young single mother named Rebecca Lawson, stood nearby, looking worried while holding the hand of her 8-year-old son. The station wagon had broken down just outside the dealership. Melissa watched from a distance. Ryan walked toward Rebecca before anyone else reached her. His pace was calm, unhurried. He didn't glance first at the vehicle. He looked at her face. Good afternoon. She smiled apologetically. I'm sorry. Ryan gently interrupted. There's nothing to apologize for. She looked surprised. My car blocked part of your entrance. We'll take care of it. He turned toward one of the technicians. Can we help push it into Bay 2? Within seconds, 3 employees joined him. No complaints, no jokes, no laughter. They simply pushed. Melissa noticed something else. After the station wagon was safely inside, Ryan crouched so he was eye level with Rebecca's son. What's your name? Eli. Ryan smiled. You like drawing? The boy nodded shyly. Ryan reached into the waiting room and returned with a fresh coloring book and a box of crayons. There you go. Eli's nervous expression disappeared. Melissa felt a familiar warmth in her chest. 1 year earlier, Ryan would have seen an old car. Now, he saw a frightened family. Marcus folded his arms. Looks different, doesn't he? Melissa smiled without taking her eyes off the scene. No. Marcus looked confused. No. He finally sees what was always there. Marcus nodded slowly. She was right. People rarely became completely different. Sometimes they simply learned to notice what had been invisible all along. Melissa reached into her pocket and touched the worn leather keychain. Soon, it would no longer belong to her. It had one final journey to make, and she already knew exactly who was ready to carry its message forward. The following Saturday morning, Scottsdale woke beneath a clear blue sky. At White Horizon Auto Group, colorful balloons lined the entrance. Folding tables were covered with coffee and homemade pastries from local bakeries, and volunteers wearing blue company shirts welcomed families as they arrived. The annual New Beginnings community drive had grown far beyond anything Melissa had imagined when she created it 12 years earlier. It was never advertised as a charity event. Melissa disliked that word. Charity often suggested one person stood above another. She preferred partnership, Every family attending had contributed something. Some had saved for years. Some had completed financial education classes. Some had repaired their credit one payment at a time. Some had volunteered hundreds of community service hours through local organizations. Nobody was receiving a gift. They were receiving an opportunity they had worked to earn. By 9 o'clock, dozens of families filled the parking lot. Children chased one another between tents while volunteers served pancakes. Mechanics answered maintenance questions free of charge. Nurses from a nearby clinic offered health screenings. Teachers collected donated backpacks for the upcoming school year. The event looked less like a dealership promotion and more like a neighborhood gathering. Melissa stood near the entrance with Emily, now 13. Emily carried her sketchbook as faithfully as Melissa carried the old leather portfolio. "You've gotten bigger," Melissa said with a smile. Emily laughed. "So have these events." Melissa looked around. "They have. But that's not the part that makes me happiest." Emily followed her mother's gaze. Ryan stood near the inspection area, greeting every family personally. He shook hands, knelt to greet children, introduced technicians by name, made sure elderly visitors had chairs in the shade. He wasn't directing attention toward himself. He was directing care toward others. Emily smiled. "He looks different." Melissa nodded. "He does." "What changed him?" Melissa thought for a moment. "I didn't." Emily looked surprised. "No." Melissa shook her head. "I gave him an opportunity. He chose what to do with it." That distinction mattered. Real growth could never be forced, only invited. Around mid-morning, Rebecca Lawson arrived driving the same green station wagon Ryan had helped push into the service bay months earlier, only now it looked completely different. The engine had been repaired through the assistance program. The faded headlights had been restored. The little dents remained. Rebecca had asked that they stay. "They remind me where we started," she had told Ryan. She parked beside the old blue Explorer. For a brief moment, the two aging vehicles sat side by side. Neither was beautiful by showroom standards. Both carried stories worth protecting. Ryan noticed immediately. He walked over. "Good morning, Rebecca." She smiled warmly. "Eli insisted we get here early." The little boy jumped out, holding a drawing tube. "I made something." Ryan crouched. "For me?" Eli nodded excitedly. Inside the tube was a colorful drawing. It showed two old vehicles, the green station wagon, the blue Explorer. Between them stood a group of smiling people holding hands. Above the picture, the child had written in uneven block letters, "People First." Ryan felt his throat tighten. "This is incredible." Eli grinned. "My mom says old cars can have new beginnings." Ryan looked toward Melissa. She had heard every word. She smiled quietly. The ceremony began shortly afterward. Olivia welcomed everyone. Marcus thanked the technicians. Local community partners received recognition. Finally, Olivia stepped back from the microphone. "It is now my honor to invite Melissa White." Applause filled the parking lot. Melissa approached the small stage without notes. She never liked reading speeches. She preferred speaking from memory and from the heart. "Thank you all for being here." She looked across the crowd. "I see nurses, teachers, veterans, mechanics, parents, children." She smiled. "I also see something else. People who refuse to give up." The applause returned briefly. Melissa raised one hand gently. "A year ago," she looked toward the old Explorer, "my vehicle stopped outside one of our dealerships." Several longtime employees smiled knowingly. "I could tell you that breakdown was inconvenient." She laughed softly. "It was. But sometimes," she paused, "life interrupts our plans because it wants to teach us something our plans never could." She looked toward Ryan. "A young salesman made a painful mistake." Ryan lowered his head slightly. Melissa continued. I made mistakes too. The audience looked surprised. I almost chose the easier path. She smiled. The easier path would have been firing him. Ryan looked up. Melissa met his eyes. But leadership isn't measured by how quickly we remove broken things. She glanced toward the two old vehicles parked together. It's measured by how patiently we repair what still has life inside. Complete silence settled over the gathering. Melissa reached into her pocket. Slowly, carefully. She removed the worn leather keychain. The edges had become even softer after so many years. The engraved words were still visible. Respect arrives before status. She held it in her palm for a long moment. When Andrew gave this to me, her voice softened. He believed these words could outlive us. She stepped away from the podium, walking directly toward Ryan. The crowd instinctively moved aside. Ryan looked confused. Melissa stopped in front of him. I've carried this every day since my husband placed it in my hand. She smiled gently. It reminded me who I wanted to become. She lifted the keychain. Today, she paused. I believe it's ready for someone else's journey. Ryan's eyes filled instantly. I can't. You can. I don't deserve it. Melissa nodded. No. Ryan looked down. I don't. She smiled warmly. None of us deserve trust. We earn it. She placed the leather keychain into his hand. I believe you have. Ryan stared silently at the faded leather. His fingers trembled. I promise. His voice broke. I'll never forget, Melissa answered softly. I know. The crowd applauded. Not loudly, not wildly. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter, more meaningful. Marcus discreetly wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. Daniel Harrison stood near the back of the audience. Pride filled his face, not because his son had succeeded, because he had become someone worth trusting. As the ceremony ended, families began walking toward their vehicles. Rebecca helped Eli buckle his seatbelt. Angela, the emergency room nurse, waved before driving away in the dependable sedan that had now carried her safely to hundreds of night shifts. Robert Ellis loaded classroom supplies into his pickup before heading toward another school year. Jessica, the grocery worker, laughed as her daughters argued over which song to play during the drive home. Each vehicle leaving the parking lot carried more than passengers. It carried restored dignity. Melissa and Emily walked slowly toward the old Explorer. Ryan caught up with them before they reached it. He looked at the familiar SUV. You know, he smiled, I don't think you should ever replace it. Melissa laughed. I wasn't planning to. Ryan looked at the faded paint. I used to see an old vehicle. He glanced at Melissa. Now I see a life built 1 mile at a time. Emily smiled. Dad would have liked that. Ryan nodded. I hope so. Melissa opened the driver's door. Before getting inside, she looked once more at Ryan. The keychain belongs to you now. He touched it carefully in his pocket. I'll carry it every day. She smiled. That's not the important part. Ryan waited. The important part. She looked around at every family leaving the dealership. Is making sure the people who walk through your doors never need to know who owns the building before they feel respected. Ryan nodded slowly. I understand. This time, Melissa believed him. The old Explorer started on the first turn of the key. Its engine settled into the familiar, steady rhythm that had carried Melissa through countless ordinary days and extraordinary moments. She drove slowly toward the exit. As she passed Building C, she noticed a young single mother pulling into the parking lot in a faded, compact car. Before Melissa could even slow down, Ryan was already walking toward her. Not toward the car, toward the driver. He smiled warmly and said words Melissa could no longer hear through the closed window. But she didn't need to. She watched the nervous expression on the young mother's face soften almost immediately. Then Ryan opened her car door, greeted her little daughter, and carried a small backpack into the office before asking a single question about financing. Melissa smiled. The circle was complete. The old leather keychain had found its next keeper. Not because it had been passed from one hand to another, but because its message had finally found another heart willing to live by it. Every person you meet is carrying a story you cannot see. A worn-out car may hold years of memories. A tired face may belong to someone working through the night to care for a family. An old jacket, a faded lunchbox, or a pair of worn shoes can represent sacrifice, resilience, and love rather than failure. The moment we believe appearances tell us everything, we stop seeing people for who they truly are. Kindness doesn't always require money, influence, or power. Sometimes it begins with a greeting, a question, a few extra minutes of listening, or the decision to treat every person with the same dignity, regardless of what they drive, wear, or own. Those small choices shape families, workplaces, and communities more than we realize. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know where you're watching from and what lessons stayed with you the most. Share your thoughts in the comments because your story may encourage someone else who needs hope today. If you believe kindness, respect, and second chances can change lives, please share this story with someone you care about and subscribe for more inspiring journeys that remind us of the good still waiting in the world.